Hey everyone, this is David Greenwald from the Davis Vanguard, and I want to talk about criminal justice reform this week and the fact that President Trump has really been a huge barrier to criminal justice reform. I had somebody post earlier this week that the reform movement has been divided, and they saw COVID as being part of the reason why it was divided and argued that prior to that, it was united. And in my view, that's not true. And while I agree, a lot of my friends in the criminal justice reform movement are conservative, a lot more than I think people recognize, and a good number of those people support Trump. I think they need to understand that despite the fact that Trump supported and signed the First Step Act, which was important legislation, but it was just one piece of the bigger puzzle. Overall, he is not a friend of criminal justice reform. Now, as I go through this, I'm going to leave out what's happening in Portland right now because I think, there's a whole other conversation that needs to take place around that. And I'm going to focus instead mostly on policing. And I think, what people need to understand is that, first of all, the police issue goes way, way beyond officer-involved shooting. I hear this all the time. People say, well, there just aren't very many officer-involved shootings, so what's the real problem here? And I've been watching court for the last 10 years, and I watch officers testify, and I watch videos of officers testifying, and there are all sorts of problems, and I'm going to get into that shortly. But the first point to understand, I think, is that police are gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. And while I agree with those who argue that prosecutors are the most powerful criminal justice actor, I also think that police play a very critical role because really, if you think about it, they are the entry point. Very few investigations are launched at the behest of the district attorney. Many more are launched because police officers make an initial arrest. And that is the key thing. They decide who gets arrested. Enforcement of the law is a subjective thing, and it's selective, and nobody wants to hear this because they think, we're catching criminals. Well, you may be catching criminals depending on how you define criminal, and we can argue over what that means, but not every person who breaks the law gets caught. So who gets caught? How do they catch them? And that means that a lot of this depends on policing strategies. What crimes do they focus on? Which ones do they enforce? And where do they put their personnel? That's a critical issue. If you're enforcing downtown of a city, it's going to be different than a upper class neighborhood, and it's going to be different than a working class neighborhood. And so that is all critical. So here's the key stat, in my opinion, that illustrates this. So we know from years of research that whites and blacks both use drugs and sell drugs at comparable rates. And yet, blacks make up about 80% of all drug-related arrests. Now, why does that happen? Well, this is all about enforcement and deployment, and it underlines the start of the racial differential. So disproportionate policing means that people of color are disproportionately arrested. And the other key thing to remember is that it starts there, it doesn't end there. So they're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be charged, they're more likely to be convicted, and if they're convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced to prison. So let's think in terms of an issue that resonates with a lot of folks, wrongful convictions. Now, a lot of people don't see wrongful convictions as being a police matter, and a lot of people don't see it as having a huge racial component, but we'll talk about the racial component another time. But let's talk about the police matter, okay? We know from the Innocence Project and their research and their exonerations what the big causes of wrongful convictions are. So we got Brady violations. Brady violation, of course, could refer to prosecutors, but it also refers to police officers. The mishandling of evidence, the destruction of evidence, all of that starts with police. Eyewitness identification problems, those are police problems. False confessions, guess who they're confessing to? Sorry, it's not the prosecutor, it's the police. So from start to finish here, we're dealing with police issues as being a root cause of wrongful convictions. Yes, prosecutors are one of my big targets. I am not letting them off the hook here. We have prosecutorial misconduct, Brady violations, bad forensic, tunnel vision, but all of this starts with police. And as I mentioned earlier, I have been watching police and criminal trials all the time. My biggest complaint is unconstitutional policing. We see the use of force problems. We see the hiding of evidence. We see planting of evidence. And we see lying on the stand. But some of the problems are even more basic, but also more fundamental. For example, a big problem, lack of knowledge of the law. You would think, oh, police officers know the law. Not so much. They're not lawyers, most of them. In fact, most of them barely have a high school education. A lot of them didn't go to college. And their training is based on all sorts of training protocols that may not be enough. And a lot of them come from rural areas and they lack a background of cultural awareness. So you have young people that are undereducated. A lot of them disproportionately are white and they lack cultural awareness. And then they're thrown into an urban environment and it's not a great fit. So much of the problems of the criminal justice system come back to the police, and yet the question, I think, is what has Trump done? And the answer appears to be not very much. So I'm going to focus on two issues, but obviously we could go much further than that. First thing he did when he became president on the criminal justice front is basically reversed what Obama did. So Obama had a series of consent decrees where the Department of Justice was going in and basically investigating and in some cases running local law enforcement. He ended all of that. There's pattern and practice reviews. These are fundamental. They investigate the police department to determine whether or not their pattern of practice is constitutional. Ended. One of the things John Burris told me about Vallejo police is that, the feds would not come in with the pattern and practice, and now he's got to rely on the state attorney general's office, and they're not trained to do that. And so we lost this key layer of oversight. The other big issue that's come up, it came up with the Supreme Court when they refused to take up the issue, and it's come up at the federal level, qualified immunity reform. Qualified immunity is critical because it shields police officers and other government officials from legal actions by victims and families whose rights are being violated. And Trump has basically called this a non-starter. So he's taken off the table the two biggest ways for the federal government to hold police accountable. He ended consent decrees and pattern and practice investigations, and he won't address qualified immunity. Now, people will point out, we've been talking a lot about race here, and white people get caught in the criminal justice system too. Obviously, it's not simply a matter of black and brown people. They also get shot and killed by police. And I agree with that. And I think we need to actually start reconceptualizing how we view whiteness. We need to think about it more as education and privilege in addition to race. Because a lot of people want to take race out. I don't agree. Because if I'm walking down the street, you don't know if I'm poor, but you know I'm white. So race matters because race is clearly evident. But clearly, poorly educated and under-resourced white people are very much disadvantaged in the criminal justice system. And I think the criminal justice reform movement should not lose track of those people. And the problem here, of course, goes well beyond the issue of policing. So let's talk about the federal death penalty. So as most people who are aware of this issue know, the death penalty is actually fading in usage in the United States. And it's fading because we have become aware of two humongous problems that are really intractable. The first is the wrongful conviction problem, where there's a possibility in the last few months we've executed innocent people. And the second problem is a racial problem. And it's not just, the race of the perpetrator, it's also the race of the victim. If you kill a white person, you are much more likely to face the death penalty than if you kill a black person. With those problems, President Trump pushed for the resumption of the federal death penalty after 17 years. 2003, 2 years after 9/11. Why are we doing this? So Daniel Lewis Lee was executed on the 14th, Wesley Ira Perkey on the 16th, and Dustin Lee Honkin on the 17th. We know that one of these guys might have been innocent. Another guy clearly was mentally ill, maybe at the time of the commission of the crime, and he certainly was suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's. So basically, we executed a guy with Alzheimer's. What kind of possible threat does this guy face to us? On Lee, his last words are, "You're killing an innocent man." Now, is he lying? Who knows? But the point is that why are we executing him? Think about this. 6 people have been executed by the federal government since the 1970s. 3 were executed last week. 2 of them very questionable in my view. Why are we doing this at this time when the nation has basically stopped executing people? Other problems that Trump has done little to nothing about. He hasn't done anything to clear out the prison population due to COVID concerns. We got all sorts of problems in federal prison. Lompoc is going crazy. And there are lots of problems with ICE facilities as well. And yet, Trump has not attempted to deal with them. Also, there are a whole wave of people, as anyone who's read my material knows, of prosecutors that are reforming the system. Trump has gone after most of them. We've seen him go after Rachel Rollins from Boston. We've seen Larry Krasner been gone after from Philadelphia. Chesa Boudin from San Francisco, and then most recently, Kim Gardner, who, made the mistake of trying to prosecute 2 lawyers who were toting weapons at protesters. So here's the bottom line. I get that the criminal justice movement spans the political spectrum, and I think that's a good thing. And I think expanding the range of criminal justice reform, so it's not just upper class white liberals, makes a lot of sense. But right now, the issues that we are focused on, COVID, race, mass incarceration, policing. They all line up against the president, and we can't ignore that. So this has been David Greenwald from the Davis Vanguard. Check us out, davisvanguard.org, and subscribe to our criminal justice newsletter, Everyday Injustice.